Hello everyone, I'm Chris from KTDC. Today we're going to be looking at a writing task 1 example, and I'm going to go through it with everyone and correct the mistakes with everyone and share some tips on how we can fix these mistakes. So first, let's take a look at the task itself. It says the diagram below gives information about the proportion of passenger kilometers traveled by different modes of transport in Shanghai in 1996 and one possible projection for their use in 2030. So there's a few things I would like to point out about this task before we get looking at the example. First, to be aware of, you need to watch out for verb tenses with this one. If you look at the 2 time periods that were given, one is 1996 and the other is 2030. So there are only 2 time periods, which means we aren't able to use any verbs or nouns that require more than 2 time periods, such as fluctuations or leveling off and things like that. Being that 1996, of course, is in the past and 2030 is in the future, we need to make use of both past tenses and future tenses, as well as some prediction phrases. In addition to that, we have 6 variables here: bus, walking, scooter, bicycle, train, and car. So we're going to need to compare between those as well. In order to do that, we will need to divide our 2 body or detail paragraphs in some kind of logical way. I'll talk about how the student does that in a minute when we get to that point. They did quite a good job with that. And with this one specifically, you need to be careful of making sure that the unit is accurate when you're writing. Percentage of passenger kilometers traveled is a little bit complicated. What it really means, it's just the total distance traveled by all of the people who used that mode of transport. So if 10 people took a bus and went 10 kilometers, 10 times 10 would be 100 passenger kilometers traveled. But you can just think of that as just the total distance traveled by all of the people who used that mode of transport. Okay, and that's really it for is what we need to talk about with analyzing. With the data itself, we can see that bus was at 39% in 1996, 22% in 2030. Walking, scooter, and bicycle all decreased or are expected to decrease, I should say, throughout this time period as well, whereas trains and cars rose or will be expected to rise during this time period. So let's take a look at what the student wrote. So their opening paragraph, the bar graph shows the percentage of passenger kilometers traveled by different kind of transport in Shanghai in 1996 and one possible projection for their use in 2030. So a couple of things here we need to talk about with this first sentence. First, there's a couple of grammar mistakes, specifically here. Let me highlight this for you. So let me mark this right here. This, of course, should be kinds of transport, different kinds of transport. This needs to be plural. So different kinds of transport in Shanghai in 1996 and one possible projection for their use in 2030. So the first part of this is okay. The second part of this sentence is copied directly from the task. One possible projection for their use in 2030. So what we need to do with this is paraphrase it a bit. So we could say something like, a likely estimation for their use in 2030, or something along those lines, or a likely prediction for their use in 2030. So let me mark that here as well. Just so we can paraphrase this a bit more. Okay. Moving on to the overview. On the whole, travelers prefer go by bus than car in 1996. However, the number of passenger kilometers traveled by car is the highest figure in 2030. So there's a few mistakes we need to talk about here as well. First, some more issues with verb tenses, which is something that I mentioned at the beginning of this. So travelers preferred going. Travelers preferred going by bus rather than by car in 1996. Okay, so this fixes this sentence. Then the second half of the overview, however, the number of passenger kilometers traveled by car, another mistake with the verb tense. We're talking about 2030, right? So 2030, we need to be using a prediction phrase, or we need to be using the future tense. So we can mark this, will be instead. So let me close all of these so we can see, however, the number of passenger kilometers traveled by car will be the highest figure in 2030. So the information in this overview is fine. It is missing a little bit more detail that should be included here. We should talk about these trends as well. So we should mention that these 4 modes of transport are expected to decrease, while these 2 are expected to increase. We talked about car becoming the highest and bus starting as the highest already, so that's fine, but we still need to talk about the trends. Okay, moving on to the detail paragraphs. So I talked earlier about needing to divide your data logically in order to compare them effectively. So what this student did is in the first body paragraph, they talked about buses, bicycles, walking, and scooters, which, if you look at the task, were the 4 that are expected to decrease. And then in the second paragraph, they mention trains and cars, which are the 2 that are expected to increase. So this is what you should be trying to do in all of your task 1s, is divide the information in a way that makes sense to the reader. And that's what the student did here. She put the 4 categories that are expected to decrease together and the 2 that are expected to increase together. So that is quite a good job with that. Now let's look at the first body paragraph in some more detail. So the biggest mistakes in here, as we will see, are with the accuracy of the language used. So as is shown by the graph, good phrase, the proportion of traveler kilometers, we'll fix that unit in a minute, took by bus in 1996 was twice as high as those in 2030 at 39% and 22% respectively. So let's talk about this sentence in more detail. First, let's talk about this unit here and the verb with it, traveler kilometers took. The verb took would have to be taken, the past participle in this case, but it's still not the correct verb that we need to use. So passenger kilometers traveled is a difficult one to paraphrase. The best one that I have come up with is total distance traveled, and then by whatever category. So total distance traveled by bus in 1996 was, we should write nearly, was nearly twice as high, and then we just don't need those here. We can get rid of this. It was nearly twice as high as in 2030 at 39% and 22% respectively. Okay, moving forward to the next part of this paragraph. Similarly, the proportion of passenger kilometers traveled by bicycle increased 27% and 3% from 1996 to 2030 in turn. So I hope you all noticed the use of the verb increased is incorrect here. Of course, it should be decreased. I'm not going to mark that here because I'm going to have to do that several times if I do, but just note that the use of increased here and then rose here and increased here should all be decreased, fell, or something else like that that shows a drop over time. So the proportion of passenger kilometers traveled by bicycle decreased from 27% to 3%. So I will make a note of how we should fix this. From 27% to 3% from 1996 to 2030. In turn, we actually don't need to use in turn or respectively in this sentence or in the rest of these here, because it's the meaning of respectively or in turn, we use those when it's not entirely clear which thing the data belongs to. But in this case, if you're saying it decreased from 27% to 3% from 1996 to 2030, you already know exactly which years the data belongs to, so you don't need to use respectively or in turn. So we can get rid of that as well. In addition, the figure for passenger kilometers traveled by foot rose. So here, of course, should be fell from 7% to 3%. So let me make a note of this. Fell from 7% to 3% between 1996 and 2030. Again, we don't need respectively here. Regarding two travelers, we don't need the two. We need to fix the beginning of this sentence to be more accurate to the unit that we're measuring. So regarding, not to, but regarding the distance traveled by scooter. So that's how we fix the beginning of this sentence. The percentage decreased from 12% to 7% from 1996 to 2030. And again, we do not need respectively in this sentence. All right. So overall, this paragraph, the biggest issue is just with the mistakes regarding increase and decrease, the mix-up of those words. The sentence structures are mostly okay, except for not using from to correctly. But the information is great, the structure is great. So let's move to the last one here. In contrast, good linking phrase to show contrast, of course. The percentage of passenger kilometers traveled by train in 1996 was 13 times than in 2030 at 0% and 13%. We're going to have to rewrite the second part of this sentence entirely. So a couple small things we need to note. First, this sentence was structured backwards in the end here. They were trying to say that in 2030 it was 13 times higher than in 1996. But of course we can see that that isn't true anyways, because you can't have 13 times 0%. So watch out for a mistake like that. But let's rewrite this sentence here. So instead, finish at in 1996 stood at 0%, but by 2030 it will rise to 13%. So in contrast, the percentage of passenger kilometers traveled by train in 1996 stood at 0%, but by 2030 it will rise to 13%. Additionally, the proportion of traveler went by car rose to 15% and 52% from 1996 to 2030. So again, we have the mistake with using from to with the percentages. So we need to say, we also have a mistake with the unit here, proportion of travelers. So we need to say something instead, like the proportion of distance traveled by car rose from 15% to 52% from 1996 to 2030, once again. This is the final sentence here, but we should add a little bit more detail here at the end. So we should say something like, so from 1996 to 2030, which will make it the most used mode of transport at that time. Just so we can include the fact that cars will become, the most used mode of transport. That is an important detail we should include in our task 1 writing, when things become the highest or things used to be the highest. So we should mention that as well. Earlier in this first paragraph, we should also mention that buses started out at the highest when we talk about them. And that's pretty much it. So overall, to conclude this, the structure of this report overall is quite good. It has an introduction, it has an overview. The overview is not quite 100% complete. Should use more information about the trends that occur. But we do have an overview that's at least halfway complete. And then the 2 detailed paragraphs are divided quite logically. But as I mentioned in the beginning, before we looked at this example report, you need to watch out for verb tenses in this one, and you need to watch out for the unit. And that is where the student made several mistakes, in addition to making mistakes with trend language. But overall, quite a good job. So I hope this was helpful for everyone, and I hope to someday see you here soon in person at KTDC. Thank you.